Well, we're talking about how protective roles can be used by genocide leaders to get people to commit genocide, and yet gender-based violence doesn't really seem protective. I mean, that seems more punitive. And there have been a couple of references to humiliation. And it's often said that the role of gender-based violence is to humiliate a society. So in that sense, it's a communication. So how do gender and gender norms facilitate this communication?
Where to begin? I think that the primary goal, almost, of genocide is humiliation, and one of those humiliations is, of course, annihilation, or it can be total genocide, right? The removal of a group from history, often their complete erasure from history, the razing of buildings, the changing of street names, etc., etc. But in the process of committing annihilation, partial destruction, total destruction, most of the ritualized atrocities are all kind of circulate around humiliating the victims, often before they're killed. And so we have to ask, well, if this weren't the point of genocide, why are people doing it, right? Why not just as efficiently as possible massacre people? Frequently, people are put through hours, days of ritualized atrocities aimed at humiliating them in every aspect one could imagine, preying on age, gender, status, relationships, etc., only to be killed afterwards. And there are two ways to look at that from the point of view of the perpetrator. One is that it is a communication about power between perpetrators themselves. So there's been a lot of work done on how public gang rapes during genocide serve to sort of cement the ties between fighting forces, right? And also create a situation in which everybody's implicated in the crime, right? But it's also a communication in a more existential way to the victims about what perpetrators think they are, their role in history is, right? The point of the victim group has been up to the... So there's a communication, I think, being made to victims as well that's very important to the perpetrators. And as with the construction of masculinity, R.W. Connell pointed this out himself, masculinity as a fragile, because contested and because constantly shifting notion needs to be constantly performed in order for it to really exist. So to be a man, which is of course incredibly important, right? If you're ascribing to a certain type of masculinity, you need to constantly perform it, right? In peacetime, as in war. When the performance of that masculinity is about humiliation, right? And using gender-based violence in these atrocity rituals that are aimed to humiliate, it has a tendency to radicalize itself. We've seen that. And so it becomes the genocidal process becomes very much about the identity formation and the constant re-articulation of the identity of the perpetrators. And I think we could do more research on how that works for women as partners, right, or in the various ways that they participate as well in genocide. When we look at gender-based violence and humiliation, I think it's important that we appreciate its radicalizing potential. A lot of the literature will treat these atrocities as excesses. They may be fun, but they're excesses. They're not the point. But they become the point. Even if initially they're not, they become the point. Perpetrators, like many of them, I think more than we'd like to think, enjoy these rituals. They're very creative. The rituals tend to spread. You can see them used by one cadre and spread to other ones. And so they're shared amongst perpetrators. And they radicalized the entire conflict, the entire genocidal basis of the conflict, to the point that perpetrators then began to look for new targets, right? You know, research on the Holocaust has shown that the Nazis didn't have an end point, right? There wasn't a group that they decided if we kill every last person in this group, right, then we're done. They were constantly looking for, the main focus was, of course, European Jews, right? But they were constantly looking for other groups and ranking them in terms of their importance, and we'll allow, you know, this percentage of this group to live and this percentage of that. We'll move on to these groups later. They were constantly planning for the future, what the new groups would be. There's an addictive quality to genocidal violence, which I think sets it apart from other forms of mass violence, in that there's no internal limit, right? And this has everything to do with the kinds of identities that are being pursued by perpetrators and the way that genocidal violence itself and their perpetration of it compounds and radicalizes their sense of identity.
I wanted to respond in a slightly different way, and I actually, once again, I'm fascinated by the format. I really appreciate the moderator getting in and offering. I really like the idea of, you know, sort of, it's like a jazz session in many ways. You know, it feels like, you know, somebody starting a moment and starting something, and then somebody else continuing. So I just want to make this process observation. But the point that came to me when I thought about this is who is watching? So communication to whom? And it's very clear that many genocides were done in silence because nobody was watching. I was here, we were here, and the whole experience ended here. Was a communication between the perpetrators and the victims, the perpetrators and the perpetrators, the perpetrators and the other victims, and that was it. But that's not true anymore. It's not true anymore because survivors survive. Because even those who are dead actually speak. There is a presence of absence. You know, you go to Poland and you ask, where are the Jews? You know, it's clearly something. You go in many places actually, and you say, where are those who are here? Where are these things? And I think that there is a very, very different collective attitude vis-a-vis the violence that is perpetrated far away. Okay, so you have these situations in which I'm clearly using this violence to communicate, but in a strange way, I am blind to the fact that somebody else in Arlington, Virginia is actually watching. Not in a voyeuristic way, but I do really care. The fact that there is a group of women today in the Congo raped. This is something that was conceptually very difficult 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 50 years ago, 100 years ago. You can go online today and you can hear the testimony of somebody that was raped yesterday and saying, this happened to me the other day in that village, and what? I think that in a strange way, what I'm trying to say is that this extraordinarily violent and tragic communication strategy is actually backfiring on the perpetrators that are trying to silence, and is actually calling us to pay attention. Because in a way, the Rome Statute is saying, you must pay attention. This is not just, I wish in the morning I would like to pay attention because I feel good, I want to pay attention. This is paying attention as something that you have to do institutionally. And so back to what we were saying about protection. What is really protecting? Who is protecting? Well, it's not a protective man. It's not the old-fashioned strong man that is going to protect this, but it's actually this common humanity that is caring enough to watch and look and care and say, that rape is not just between you and you. It's not just between a perpetrator and a victim. It's also me. And if I don't intervene, if I do not care, if I do not do something, there is something wrong with me. There is something wrong with my humanity. There is something wrong with my... Am I making any sense? So there is a communication that seems to me is emerging. It's not there yet. I don't want to say that we are paying attention. And honestly, I find myself struggling with this because I struggle with numbers. You know, if I go into any Truth and Reconciliation Commission website, I have thousands of testimonies that are just way too many for me to process. And so the question that I have is there a way that we could listen? Is there a way that we could welcome? Is there a way that we could embrace? Is there a way that we could caringly hear what the perpetrator didn't want anybody to hear? What the perpetrator wanted to disappear from the face of the earth? And, you know, and can that listening to the suffering in a way spur a new response or a different change fundamentally the conversation?
Yes.
Flipping it in such a way of saying, no, it's not this communication dominance, violently destructive, but it's...
Okay, because we're running
Just
short.
follow on. I just want to follow up on the theme of humiliation, but also the theme of performance. I think one of the really valuable things in Elisa's work is pointing out the extent to which those atrocities are performed for an audience that consists of the narrower, broader victim group. So you're talking about, for example, the performance of atrocity, you know, raping a woman in front of her husband sends a particular message. I think very often those atrocities are constructed. The audience is the proximate victim and the broader victim group. I don't think they're thinking much about international responses, but I think your point is good that they do give us a lot to work with unintentionally and a lot of evidence of genocidal processes. I just wanted to say about humiliation that Elisa said that the primary goal of genocide is often humiliation. I think humiliation is also one of the most profound causes of genocide, and that it's a particularly gendered form of humiliation. I think that, as I mentioned with the Rwandan Hutu women example, there are ways in which women are feel humiliation and use that as a spur to support genocidal enterprises. I think it tends to be rather limited, a limited typology of humiliation, reflecting the fact that women are generally constrained to a narrower range of roles. And so it's likely to be attacks on their sexual purity or upon their sexual reproductive capacity or their role as mothers or whatever. Men, partly because masculinities are so fragile, and partly because men occupy in patriarchal societies, such a broader range of roles, I think feel a broader range of humiliations in a gendered sense as a result. And so when you talk about, let's say, for example, military defeat in Germany, because men were the active military agents there, they felt that humiliation in a particular way that I think women didn't. And looking at the way that humiliated males are seek to expiate their humiliation through violence, including genocidal violence, I think is a very useful insight into this particular psychology of masculinity.
And I'll just add about 10 seconds to that, which is that we're talking about this as a form of communication, but it's also a form of silencing, or more specifically, a form of setting boundaries between what can be said and what can't be said, right? And you'll see this a lot. I'll see this a lot when working with survivors of genocide, that men will tell very, very different stories about their experiences of victimization, oftentimes glorifying their survival, whereas women will oftentimes have to talk about their experiences in even the third person, right? Not even be able to talk about it in the first person because it's a story that can't be told, right? So that's also at work, especially in sexual violence perpetrated towards men, where those are oftentimes stories that really can't be told in the public domain because they're just so very humiliating and they so very much break